Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. How are you? I'm just doing this really quick video in case you missed class on Tuesday because you were at DECA, just so you know what notes the class took. And we did a little bit of time for some reading as well. Again, like half the class was gone, so I'm just kind of noting some of the notes that we did in the first part of the class. We did talk about causes of industrialization. This is really specific to the United States context. You may have looked at industrialization last year in terms of Britain and some other places where the Industrial Revolution starts to travel, or at least places that become very affected by the Industrial Revolution and in different ways. You know, this is a time of a changing global economy, but we see some of the ways in which the United States, and maybe the time period, especially after the US Civil War, we see a lot of rapid industrialization, very much along the lines of what happened in Britain. And, you know, why is this the case? What kind of recipe, in a sense, is put together? One thing, of course, is that we have a lot of labor in abundance. Some of this is immigrant labor, and we'll talk about immigration kind of in a later date. We also see a great deal of movement from rural areas to cities, although most people in the time period of, say, 1880, still live in rural areas. The cities are growing at this time, so urbanization, immigration, and industrialization, kind of track very much together as forces that are influencing each other. Also, we do have a variety of new entrepreneurs, business people, maybe even middle managers, and a whole bunch of new strategies. Some of that will be problematic because it will lead to monopoly and things like that. And we'll see all kinds of issues with what today we refer to as antitrust. They did in the time period too. We tend to mean that as like anti-monopoly. For the time, a trust was a very specific consolidation tool. There is a market that's growing because the US population is increasing. This is not only because of Western expansion, but due to immigration and also due to, kind of natural reproduction. We end up with a much higher US population. We have a lot of government investment in the economy, and you can attach this to basically economic development, especially for the North and for industrialization. And a lot of this is in the process of technology, what we would today call engineering. A lot of that research and development also starts to get funded by government. And we see this subsidy coming from the government, especially in the railroads. So lots and lots of economic growth. And this is in particular a platform of the Republican Party. So the same party that, rises in the late 1850s as an anti-slavery party, anti-slavery in the West. It's not necessarily anti-slavery everywhere, but anti-slavery in the West. That same Republican Party has some goals of using the federal government as a tool of economic development, kind of creating a national economy. We see a lot of abundant natural resources, technology that goes along with that, and infrastructure improvements. So the ways in which the railroad creates an increase in industrialization, because now there's this just kind of end-to-end market. So there's a couple of things to kind of think of with that. We also talked about the railroads as a very, very specific example, and maybe the earliest example of this like consolidated, very, very significant accumulation of capital. It is not easy to create a railroad overnight, and it requires a great deal of accumulation of capital. So even very wealthy people that started businesses couldn't necessarily do a giant, way to get into the to get into the business. They had to depend on speculation and investments from a whole bunch of different people. But that's something that we see. The railroads are also going to become really influential in doing some business practices. So this might be where we see consolidation efforts toward pools and trusts and different ways of basically eliminating competition so they could take advantage of higher prices, at least not the lowest price. If you're into economics and you're looking at kind of perfect competition, the increased degree of competition just drives down the price for everyone. If you're on the business side of things, great for consumers, not as great for your businesses. Standardization, time is something that becomes very much manipulated by the railroad schedules. Life is so local before the development of the railroads that it could be, a different time of day in one town that's next to another town. People are relying on kind of the sun to detail their time of day. When is sun up, when is sundown? And in the case of the railroads, where you have to kind of have these like rigorous schedules that have to go kind of from end to end of the country, we end up with our standard, time. So, my kid, for example, went to school in Indiana, and in Indiana is the same, time zone in some parts of Indiana as we are here. So I could drive out to Indiana and not experience a time change. If she went like an hour south or to Chicago, in Illinois, it was a time change. So, there's a line that this is, Eastern Standard Time and so on. So that comes about. The Transcontinental Railroad, just have a sense of when that takes place. It's in 1869 that we see kind of this collaborative effort to build and basically merge, two railroad lines so that the railroad goes across the country. And we see a massive shift from iron as a really exclusive kind of resource for production to something that becomes using iron ore to refine into steel. That becomes a very high-tech process, and steel becomes an incredibly significant industry in and of itself. It's where Andrew Carnegie will make all of his money. The steel industry is selling to the railroads, so the railroads and steel are kind of growing up together, and also steel in the way in which buildings are designed and structured. There's just much more capacity for businesses to have with the use of steel in terms of construction. Okay, this is just a map to give you an idea of what railroads looked like and what the railroad lines looked like in 1880. So at the time of like the U.S. Civil War in 1860, we know there are a lot more railroad lines in the Northeast than there were in the South, and we can kind of see that on this map. The South will try to catch up in the time period of the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Of course, many parts of the South are devastated by civil wars. Not all of these railroads necessarily have the exact same standards. Sometimes the track widths didn't match, or all kinds of things with early railroads. So it's not a seamless system. So you see these like random railroads in Florida that just go from one part to another. And we see, the West, where we're starting to see a great deal of expansion of railroads, especially in places like California, maybe Utah as a hub, Colorado as another hub, and of course, Chicago, all the way in Illinois near the Great Lakes. But in the time period after 1880, we'll see a tremendous amount of efforts to work some more to create railroads that are going to facilitate transportation from the West to the East, especially regarding agriculture. So you can see the railroads that are in like Nebraska and Kansas, for example. And, some of these spaces out West are still considered territories outside of the state of Texas and the state of California, the state of Oregon. We still have quite a few territories at the time of 1880. So just to kind of give you a sense of that, a lot of railroads also collapse, and the economy that's very tied to railroads is a little bit like the Wild West. It's incredibly high risk investment. Many people are involved in the investments, and so there's a lot of capital that gets accumulated. One of the efforts is all about, trying to create this very, very significant infrastructure, and then, trying to outweigh others. Competition, for some of you in econ, think of the railroads sort of become almost like a natural monopoly. You're not going to have 80 railroad lines, competing with each other, all going in the same direction. But these railroads kind of create consolidated, massive corporations, and that structure gets emulated, throughout the industrial period. Of course, as we see the expansion of the railroad, the federal government is also heavily involved in granting land to railroad companies, as well as like direct subsidies. So this is an effort that's not only the accumulation of capital from private investors and banks and financiers and things like that, we're also seeing a great deal of resources coming from the government. And a lot of those efforts also include military efforts, especially in the decades after the US Civil War, that affect indigenous peoples on the plains. So in the Dakotas regions, for example, more in the middle of the country. At this point, we're not really talking about the Western or the Mexican cession. We're really looking at areas where there was a great deal of buffalo. This is a photo that's taken from a business in Canada that had acquired from the US government all of these buffalo skulls for the purpose of grinding them down to fertilizer. So the, scale of killing of buffalo so that the railroads could come through, obviously has a massive impact on many of the indigenous peoples of the plains because, the Lakota and the Dakota, various groups are going to succumb to, massive lifestyle changes, and ultimately reservations, and then forced to take on individual, plots of land. So there's a great deal of policies that the government will try, but we get a sense in this photo of some of the way in which capitalism and industrialization is kind of connected to the, land acquisition that the U.S. government is involved in. We also, see, interestingly, in the country of Peru, so just to kind of put a South American spin on things, fertilizer is in massive demand in the time period because, agriculture is industrializing a lot of mechanical equipment that is enabling a great deal of productivity in agriculture is leading to these massive scales of food production, and fertilizer becomes really important. And off the islands of Peru, there was this basically bird poop called guano that was filled with nitrates, and it becomes very high in demand. So we see Peru in like the 1840s, 1850s start to become very wealthy as a result of some of this guano production. So, very kind of interesting thing. This is just a closer look at that same photo, and I think we kind of get a sense of the way in which, this industrial kind of might, in a sense, is depicted. We're getting almost like a vibe, of what that is about, with the gentleman's foot on the skull. And, this kind of gives us certain ideas. This is not only about, manifest destiny. This is also about, capitalism and profit. This just gives you an image of some of this, Eastern Central, Mountain Time, etc. And I think this is the last slide that we did, and we'll just kind of note this. We did talk about the railroad industry as being one very Wild West, and with a lot of lack of regulation from the government, which is the theme of this time period. This time period we tend to describe as very laissez-faire, right? The government is not really tied to regulating the economy. Anything that is the case is very, very slim, right? So when we start to introduce things like, the Interstate Commerce Commission, it's like one tool out of very few, that the government actually has to regulate businesses, especially these like businesses of such a size. So we have a couple of outgrowths of this. There's also no Federal Reserve Bank at this time. So there's really no significant way to achieve monetary policy. So you get all kinds of railroads that overbuild, accumulate capital, rush into building, maybe similar to today's data centers, where it's probably likely that at some point in the future, some, investors are going to lose their shirts related to data centers. This is what was happening. At the time, we get these speculative bubbles where, the value of stocks that are connected to the railroad corporations, are just growing and growing and growing and growing, and tons of people are investing. And at one point, the stock would just drop, and you'd kind of get these panics that would happen to the entire economy because there was like stress in the railroad industries, and there would be kind of like a shout out all at one time. We're a little less confident about the direction of where things are going. And so that's commonplace. Rebates are ways in which railroads would negotiate with other companies. Rebates, for example, for Rockefeller Standard Oil was basically a discount, unfair pricing. There was very little in the way of antitrust regulation in the 1870s, for example, so we don't see a lot of protection for particular users of the railroad. And pools is just straight up collusion without any laws that prohibit it. Pools would be secret agreements, maybe even very open agreements to basically fix rates, share profits, have a group of railroads essentially operating as some type of monopoly. Okay. And of course, this was also a time of a great deal of political corruption, right? People involved in scandals. Okay?